The spark doctor Naomi Carter was the kind of woman who carried presence without needing to announce it. She had built her reputation brick by brick, over decades of challenges that would have crushed someone weaker, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had endured storms and learned to walk out of them stronger. As the founder and CEO of Carter Dynamics, a multinational technology and aerospace corporation that had contracts with governments and airlines across the globe, she was used to operating at 30,000 feet, both literally and figuratively. But what she valued most was not the luxury her position afforded her. It was the dignity, respect, and fairness she had fought for, not only for herself but for the people who looked up to her as proof that boundaries could be broken. That afternoon, she boarded her own jet for what was supposed to be a smooth flight to a high-level partners meeting in New York, unaware that the journey would soon turn into an unforgettable test of strength, character, and composure. The cabin lights cast a bluish-white glow over the polished leather seats, the kind of glow that seemed designed to showcase perfection rather than comfort. Everything about the jet radiated precision and luxury. The gleaming wood panels, the glassware that sparkled under the soft lighting, the faint aroma of citrus woven into the air conditioning. Naomi carried herself into the first-class section, not with flamboyance but with ease, dressed in a tailored navy suit that complemented the richness of her skin and a silk blouse that shimmered faintly with every step. She had just concluded a series of board calls and was finally allowing herself a moment of quiet before what promised to be another grueling week. She reached her seat, placed her leather bag on the tray table, and exhaled softly, preparing to settle in. But even before she could fasten her belt, an energy shift moved through the aisle, subtle at first, then hardening like ice forming on water. Jenna Matthews, the senior flight attendant on duty, moved toward Naomi with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Jenna's reputation among some passengers had already been whispered in quiet tones, efficient, polished but cold. She liked control, she liked order, and she particularly liked reminding people of their place when she thought they had stepped out of line. To Jenna, the first-class cabin was a temple of hierarchy, and she was the gatekeeper. She approached Naomi with an expression that looked more like suspicion than courtesy, her manicured nails tapping lightly against the tablet she carried, her eyes scanning Naomi's face and attire in a way that betrayed judgment rather than service. "Excuse me," Jenna said, her voice smooth but laced with something sharp beneath the surface. "I think you may have taken the wrong seat. This is first class. Passengers for business and economy are seated further back." Her words were delivered softly enough that the nearest passengers could still hear, and already, a few curious heads lifted, their attention drawn like moths to a flame. Naomi, calm and unflinching, reached into her bag, withdrew her boarding pass and handed it to Jenna. "I am exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied evenly, her tone neither defensive nor aggressive but steady, like a metronome, keeping time. Jenna took the ticket, glanced at it quickly, then let out a small laugh, a sound that grated against the quiet cabin. "I'm not sure how this happened," she said, her words deliberately slow, "but mistakes do happen. I'll need you to move to the back until we sort this out." Naomi's gaze sharpened. "There is no mistake," she said simply, her eyes locked on Jenna's. Around them, passengers leaned slightly, their breath suspended in the charged silence. In row 2, a businessman adjusted his glasses, his phone already in his hand as if sensing the drama unfolding. In row 3, a woman tugged nervously at her necklace, her eyes darting between Naomi and Jenna, recalling the sting of being dismissed in her own past, but Jenna was not finished. She raised her voice slightly, enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Ma'am, first class is for paying customers, not for freeloaders. If you don't comply, we'll have security remove you." Her voice carried the kind of finality she had used countless times to silence complaints and shut down passengers who dared to resist her authority. She leaned closer, her perfume cutting through the cabin's citrus scent. And then, with a swift movement so sudden it stunned everyone around, Jenna slapped Naomi's ticket back against her chest, her fingers grazing Naomi's collarbone with unnecessary force. The sound of paper smacking against fabric echoed louder than it should have, like a gavel striking down in judgment. The shock was immediate. A hush fell over the cabin, heavier than silence. Naomi did not flinch, did not lower her gaze, did not allow her composure to crack. She lifted the ticket slowly, set it on her tray table, and folded her hands in her lap with the kind of poise that turned the entire act into a statement. Jenna's smirk widened as she pulled out her phone, angling it slightly as if to capture what she believed would become another viral moment of control. "Some people never learn," she muttered under her breath, but the words carried, hanging in the air like smoke. What Jenna did not realize, however, was that every second was being recorded not only on her own phone, but also on the devices of passengers who had already pressed record. The businessman in row 2, his glasses reflecting the glow of his screen, hesitated but did not stop. The woman in row 3, though reluctant, kept her camera steady. They knew they were witnessing something that would not remain confined to that cabin. But while the devices documented, Naomi lived it. Her dignity under attack, her presence challenged, her worth questioned, not by accident but by design. And still she remained still, her silence louder than Jenna's words. The captain's voice broke through the PA, announcing that departure would begin in 5 minutes. But the passenger's attention was no longer on the schedule. It was locked on the aisle, on the two women facing each other, one radiating arrogance, the other radiating quiet power. Naomi leaned back in her seat, lifted her chin, and spoke, with calm precision. "I am not moving," she said, "and if you believe otherwise, call the captain. He will tell you who I am." The words were not shouted, not even loud, but they carried through the cabin with a weight that made even those watching feel it in their chests. Jenna faltered just for a second but quickly regained her smirk. "We'll see about that," she said, her thumb hovering over her phone screen. "5 minutes, sweetheart. Then we'll see how important you really are." She spun on her heel, the sound of her shoes clicking against the carpet like punctuation, marks, and disappeared toward the galley. The cabin held its breath. The businessman in row 2 shifted uncomfortably, lowering his phone. The woman in row 3 rubbed her chain nervously. Even those who had initially smirked at Jenna's words now sat stiff, uncertain. Something deeper than a seating dispute was unfolding, something that went beyond tickets and procedures. It was about respect. It was about dignity, and the spark had just been lit. The silence before the storm. The cabin of the jet seemed to freeze in time after Jenna's slap and mocking words, as though the air itself had been pulled tight across invisible strings. The hum of the auxiliary power unit was steady. The dim blue light bathed the polished surfaces in an almost sterile glow, and yet beneath the mechanical rhythm, something more human churned. Fear, anger, curiosity. Every passenger felt it, though each experienced it differently. Some were outraged but silent, some were entertained but uncomfortable, and some were afraid because they knew too well what it felt like to be judged before being understood. For Naomi Carter, however, it was not fear or even anger that filled her chest. It was the familiar weight of responsibility, the knowledge that every move she made now mattered, not only for her dignity, but for the thousands who would eventually hear of this story and find either courage or despair in how it was resolved. She leaned back in her seat, her hands folded neatly over the ticket Jenna had slapped against her, just moments earlier. Her breathing was steady, her chin lifted, her eyes calm. Those who watched her closely could not miss it. She was not a woman on the verge of losing her composure. She was a woman calculating, remembering, and preparing to respond not as a victim of insult, but as a leader who had faced much worse and endured. A soft memory flickered in her mind, unbidden, yet fitting. She was 15 years old again, standing in a small classroom in Atlanta, raising her hand to answer a math question that the teacher had insisted was too complex for someone like her. She remembered the laughter that spread across the room when she insisted on working it out on the board, and the hush that fell when she solved it flawlessly. That same quiet defiance now pulsed through her veins. History had a way of repeating itself, and every time Naomi had refused to bow. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats as the tension deepened. In row 1, a couple whispered behind cupped hands, their voices low but their eyes wide. The businessman in row 2 continued recording, though his hands trembled slightly, betraying that even he was uncertain whether this spectacle would end in humiliation or revelation. In row 3, the woman with the chain pressed the charm tightly into her palm, feeling its cool metal edge, remembering her own scars of dismissal in professional settings. She silently rooted for Naomi, though she dared not speak. The silence grew, thicker, heavier, as if everyone was waiting for Naomi to explode or for security to march down the aisle and drag her away. But Naomi did neither. She simply sat, still and calm, exuding the kind of control that unsettled those who thrived on chaos. When Jenna returned to the galley, she pulled aside Derek Johnson, the operations manager assigned to oversee in-flight compliance. Derek was a man who loved rules not because he believed in fairness, but because rules gave him power over others. He was tall, his posture rigid, and his clipboard always clutched to his chest like a badge of honor. Jenna whispered fiercely into his ear, her words carrying venom, painting Naomi as uncooperative, arrogant, and defiant. She framed the scene as though Naomi had forced herself into a place where she did not belong and was now resisting authority. Derek frowned, nodding as if the words confirmed what he already wanted to believe. "We can't delay departure for this," he muttered. "Procedure is procedure. If she refuses, we'll remove her." Jenna's lips curled into a thin smile, satisfied that her narrative was taking hold. But what neither Jenna nor Derek understood was that Naomi's silence was not weakness, and it was not indecision. It was strength, an unshakable core that had been tempered by decades of surviving in boardrooms where she was the only black woman at the table, of facing investors who doubted her worth until she turned their doubts into profits, of enduring whispers that she did not belong until she redefined what belonging meant. She had learned long ago that silence could be louder than shouting, and patience could be sharper than confrontation. By not reacting to Jenna's provocation, she had already shifted the power dynamic. It was no longer about whether she belonged in first class. It was about how everyone else would justify their actions when the truth revealed itself. The captain's voice came again over the PA, announcing 4 minutes to departure. His tone was steady, professional, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the cockpit door. The ticking countdown felt like a drumbeat of inevitability to some, but for Naomi, it was simply time. Time that would reveal who around her stood for dignity and who hid behind policy. She took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the edge of her leather case, the one she always carried. Inside were cards embossed with her name, documents of contracts her company had signed, proofs of her authority that needed no performance, no theatrics, only clarity. She did not reach for them yet. She did not need to. The moment was not ready, and Naomi understood timing better than anyone. Leadership was not about reacting to every insult. It was about choosing the precise moment to act so that the impact would be unforgettable. In row 2, the businessman finally lowered his phone, though he had already recorded enough. He glanced around nervously, catching the eyes of others who seemed less eager now to treat the moment as entertainment. There was a shift happening, subtle but real. The passengers were beginning to sense that Naomi was not simply a random woman, refusing to move. She carried herself with too much authority, too much composure, too much weight. And yet Jenna, emboldened by Derek's agreement, returned to Naomi with her chin high. "Ma'am," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "this is your last chance. Move to the back or face removal. Security is on standby." Her words were sharp, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, uncertainty, because Naomi still had not flinched, still had not broken, still had not raised her voice. Naomi lifted her gaze slowly, her voice steady when she finally replied. "I told you before, I am not moving. Call the captain if you doubt me. He will explain everything." Her words hung in the air like stone dropped into water, rippling outward. Several passengers inhaled sharply, recognizing the certainty behind her tone. Even Derek frowned slightly, though he masked it quickly with a cough. Jenna scowled, but her smirk faltered just enough for Naomi to notice. Naomi leaned back again, her calm unshaken. She had planted the seed of doubt, and she knew it. The minutes ticked away. The PA droned. The tension grew unbearable. Passengers, hearts raced as if they themselves were on trial, caught in the uncomfortable space between what was right and what was routine. But Naomi was not racing. She was waiting for the storm to break, waiting for the silence to crack, waiting for the exact moment when the truth would shine through the thin layers of arrogance, ignorance, and prejudice that had tried to bury it. And in that silence before the storm, she smiled faintly to herself, not with joy, but with certainty. She had been here before, and once again she would not be moved. The CEO's authority. The tension inside the cabin had grown so dense that even the hum of the engines preparing for departure felt muffled under its weight. Every glance, every whispered word, every nervous shuffle of passengers' hands was a signal of the storm building silently. Naomi Carter remained still in her seat, her back straight, her face calm, her ticket lying neatly on the tray table as if it were no longer the object of dispute, but rather a symbol of the insult she had endured. She had been quiet long enough, and while silence had bought her time and respect, the moment had arrived for her to step into her true strength. The insult had already exposed the arrogance of those who underestimated her, but now it was time to remind them that they were dealing not with a powerless passenger, but with one of the most influential women in global aviation. Jenna returned, emboldened by Derek's cold approval, her lips curled into a smile that looked more like a sneer. She had expected Naomi to break down, to raise her voice, or to comply under pressure. Instead, Naomi's silence unnerved her, though she tried not to show it. "Security is waiting," Jenna announced, raising her voice so the entire first-class cabin could hear. "If you refuse to move, we will have no choice but to escort you off this flight. You're holding up everyone else here." The words rolled out with rehearsed authority, but even as she said them, a faint tremor edged her tone. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Some nodded as if agreeing with Jenna's statement about delays, while others frowned, uneasy with the way the situation had spiraled. Naomi turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto Jenna with a calm so steady that it carried the weight of command. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was measured, deliberate, and undeniable. "If you believe I do not belong here," she said, "then I ask again, call your captain. He will tell you who I am, and if he does not, I will show you myself." She paused, letting her words sink into the heavy air, then leaned forward slightly, her hands resting over the leather business case on her lap. "But understand this. I will not tolerate being humiliated, not on an aircraft that my company helps to keep in the sky." The words hung in the cabin like an unexpected clap of thunder. Some passengers gasped softly, others stiffened in their seats. Derek narrowed his eyes, his clipboard creaking under his tightened grip. Jenna faltered, her smirk fading as confusion clouded her expression. "Your company?" she repeated, her voice brittle. Naomi said nothing at first, only unlocking her case with a quiet click, the sound sharp and deliberate against the silence. She withdrew a sleek black card embossed with her name in gold letters. Dr. Naomi Carter, founder and CEO, Carter Dynamics. She placed it on the tray table with the same composure one might place a chess piece at a decisive point in the game. Then she withdrew a second document, a contract outlining Carter Dynamics' partnership with the airline's parent company, the very contract that allowed jets like this one to exist under lease agreements and maintenance programs controlled by her corporation. She slid the document across the tray, her finger pressing lightly on the signature line. Jenna's face drained of color. Derek's brows furrowed as he stepped closer to inspect the card and the document, his lips parting as though to object, but the words caught in his throat. The passengers leaned in with hushed murmurs rippling through the cabin like a wave. The businessman in row 2 forgot all about recording and lowered his phone completely, his eyes wide with the dawning realization of who sat before them. The woman in row 3 clasped her chain tighter, her breath catching as she whispered under her breath, "She owns it. She actually owns it." The entire cabin felt the shift, the sudden inversion of authority, the collapse of Jenna's false dominance. Naomi, still calm, looked at Derek, then at Jenna, and finally let her gaze sweep across the cabin, making eye contact with more than one passenger. "For years," she said evenly, "I have watched people use rules to strip others of their dignity. They confuse arrogance with authority and mistake humiliation for control. But you will not do that to me today. Not when I am not only your passenger but your partner in keeping this airline alive." Her words resonated with an unshakable power. She did not need to raise her voice because the truth itself amplified her presence. At that moment, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Mark Rodriguez stepped out, his face calm but his eyes sharp, aware that something critical was unfolding. He paused at the threshold, taking in the tense scene. The passengers' anxious faces, Jenna's frozen stance, Derek clutching his clipboard, and Naomi seated with her card and contract on display. He walked forward slowly, the golden light from the cockpit spilling into the cabin, warming the icy atmosphere. "What's happening here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority that even Jenna dared not challenge. Before Jenna could speak, Naomi lifted the card and handed it to the captain. "Perhaps you should be the one to explain," she said, her tone calm, her eyes steady. The captain glanced at the card, then at Naomi, and recognition flickered across his face. His expression shifted from detached professionalism to stunned awareness. "Dr. Carter," he whispered, almost under his breath. Then, louder, so everyone could hear, "Dr. Naomi Carter is not only a passenger, she is the founder and CEO of Carter Dynamics, one of our parent company's largest partners." The words rolled through the cabin like a tidal wave. Murmurs rose instantly, disbelief colliding with awe. Jenna's smirk evaporated, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Derek's posture stiffened, his face flushing with the weight of humiliation. Several passengers gasped audibly, some exchanging glances of regret for having doubted Naomi, others stunned that they had nearly watched a powerful woman be dismissed as if she were nothing. Naomi remained still, her calm composure making her appear taller than anyone else in that cabin. She did not gloat, did not sneer, did not revel in the shift of power. She simply sat as she always had, dignified, unshaken, and resolute. The captain turned his gaze sharply to Jenna and Derek. His voice was low but carried fury beneath its control. "Do you realize what you've done? Do you understand the gravity of humiliating not just any passenger but our partner on our own leased aircraft?" His words struck harder than any shout could have. Jenna stammered, I didn't know. I thought—" Derek tried to interject. She refused to comply with procedure, but Naomi raised her hand slightly, silencing them both with the kind of authority that did not need permission. "I don't care about apologies," she said firmly, her eyes narrowing just enough to pierce their defenses. "What I care about is accountability. What happened here is not a mistake. It is a reflection of arrogance and prejudice. And it ends now." The finality of her words echoed in the cabin, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the passengers felt a sense of release, a sense that justice was finally stepping forward. Naomi had revealed her authority, and the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The silence before the storm had passed. The storm itself had arrived. The firing, the golden light spilling from the cockpit door lingered across the aisle like a narrow sunbeam breaking through storm clouds, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the cabin felt warmer. As though authority had shifted from pettiness to principle, Captain Mark Rodriguez stood still for a moment, holding Dr. Naomi Carter's card in his hand, his face set with recognition and restrained fury. Everyone could see the subtle change in him. His shoulders straightened, his jaw tightened, and his voice dropped to a lower register, the kind reserved for moments when truth could no longer be avoided. He turned toward the passengers, toward Derek with his clipboard, and toward Jenna. who had once strutted with arrogance but now looked pale, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said firmly, "this flight has just witnessed a violation of both protocol and respect. Dr. Naomi Carter is not only our passenger, she is a valued partner and one of the key leaders whose company makes flights like this possible. She has been treated with disrespect that is unacceptable, unprofessional, and in direct violation of company policy. As captain, I cannot allow this behavior to stand." His words were not shouted, but they rang through the cabin with the finality of a verdict. Passengers leaned back in their seats, exchanging glances heavy with awe. They had expected confrontation, perhaps chaos, but they had not expected a declaration of justice delivered so plainly. Jenna's lips parted as if to protest, but Naomi raised her hand, a quiet gesture that silenced even the boldest instinct. She leaned forward, her voice calm but carrying a weight that pressed against every ear. "Captain, I will make this very simple," she said. "What happened today is not a misunderstanding. It was not confusion. It was arrogance. Arrogance. That could have humiliated me if I had been anyone else, if I had not been who I am, if I did not carry the authority that I do. I would have been dragged off this plane like baggage. And that is precisely why this cannot end with an apology." Her tone was steady, her composure unshaken, her words deliberate. Naomi reached into her case once more, withdrawing a second document, this one heavier than the first, its pages embossed with seals and signatures. She laid it on the tray table, opening it carefully so that both Derek and Jenna could see. "This," she explained, "is the contractual lease agreement between Carter Dynamics and your parent company. Section 47, subsection 3, clearly outlines anti-discrimination clauses, immediate termination protocols for violations, and penalties for failure to act within 1 hour of an incident." She tapped the page with one manicured finger, the sound of her nail against paper echoing like a gavel strike. "You are in breach, and I intend to see the clause enforced now." The cabin seemed to draw in a collective breath. The businessman in row 2 shook his head in disbelief, whispering under his breath, "She really owns it all." The woman in row 3 closed her eyes, clutching her chain so tightly her knuckles turned white, whispering a prayer of gratitude that someone with power had chosen not to remain silent. Even those who had initially sided with Jenna's words now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, ashamed of their assumptions. Derek swallowed hard, his clipboard trembling slightly in his grip. "Dr. Carter, with respect, these matters usually go through corporate channels." But Naomi cut him off with a single glance, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "Corporate channels are slow, Derek. They are designed to delay accountability until the moment passes and the world forgets. I am not giving you that luxury. The breach happened here, in this cabin, in front of these witnesses, and it will be resolved here before this plane ever leaves the ground." Her words carried the weight of someone who had fought too many battles in boardrooms to let this one slip into bureaucracy. The captain nodded slowly, understanding both the urgency and the inevitability of her demand. He retrieved his satellite phone from his belt, dialed a direct line, and within moments connected to Robert Morrison, the regional director of operations. The speaker was activated so that Naomi's voice could be heard clearly by the other side. "Robert," the captain said firmly, "we have a situation on board. Dr. Naomi Carter, CEO of Carter Dynamics, has been subjected to discriminatory treatment by a member of our crew. She has invoked Section 47 of the lease contract. Immediate resolution is required." There was a pause on the line, then Morrison's voice came through, calm but tense. "Put her on." Naomi leaned slightly forward, her hands folded, her voice crisp and unwavering. She recounted everything, not with embellishment, not with dramatics, but with the precision of a surgeon. The slap of the ticket against her chest, the words about freeloading, the live stream Jenna had initiated without her consent, the repeated refusal to verify her documentation before attempting removal. She described it all plainly, letting the weight of facts crush any attempt at excuse. When she finished, there was silence, broken only by Morrison's measured reply. "Dr. Carter, On behalf of Consolidated Airways International, I extend our deepest apology. Please tell me what actions you expect from us at this moment." Naomi's eyes flicked briefly toward Jenna, who now stood trembling, her arrogance shattered, her face pale. Then to Derek, who looked as though the clipboard in his hands was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Finally, she looked back at the passengers, many of whom held their breath, waiting to hear her verdict. "3 immediate actions," she said evenly. "First, the termination of the flight attendant responsible for this act of humiliation. Second, the suspension and retraining of the operations manager, who escalated the situation without verification. Third, a formal apology issued within 1 hour acknowledging the discriminatory nature of this incident. Anything less would make your apology empty." Morrison did not hesitate. "Consider it done," he replied. "The attendant is terminated, effective immediately. The manager will be relieved of duty and reassigned for retraining, and I will personally issue the public apology within the hour. You have my word." The words fell across the cabin like rain breaking a drought. The passengers sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. An ordinary confrontation between a passenger and crew had transformed into a moment of accountability, justice, and reform, all because Naomi had chosen not to remain silent. Jenna lowered her head, her phone slipping from her trembling fingers, the screen going dark as though ashamed of its own reflection. Derek sank into a seat nearby, his clipboard useless in his hands, the authority he once clung to dissolved. Naomi exhaled softly, not with triumph but with resolve. She turned her gaze back to the captain, her voice gentle now but still firm. "Captain Rodriguez, I thank you for standing with truth. But this does not end here. This airline will need to address systemic issues, not just the individuals, and I will be watching to ensure that it happens." The captain nodded, his respect evident in his posture. "Understood, Dr. Carter. I assure you your words carry weight far beyond this." Cabin. For the passengers, the scene etched itself into memory. They had expected delay, perhaps drama, but what they had witnessed was history. A woman refusing to be humiliated, a leader demanding justice in real time, and the powerful being reminded that respect cannot be denied when truth stands firm. Naomi had fired an entire crew not with rage but with dignity, not with vengeance but with principle. And in doing so, she had left an imprint on everyone who sat in that cabin, one they would never forget. The legacy, the silence that followed. Robert Morrison's promise was unlike the tension-filled hush that had gripped the cabin earlier. This silence was different. It was a release. The kind of stillness that settles in after thunder has rolled across the sky and left behind the heavy scent of rain. Passengers shifted in their seats, not with unease, but with reverence. They had just witnessed something that none of them would ever forget. Dr. Naomi Carter had not only defended her dignity, but had demanded change, right there in real time without waiting for committees, press releases, or excuses. She had forced accountability to happen in minutes, not months. That, more than anything, left them in awe. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her case, her breathing calm. She had not raised her voice, had not broken down, had not lashed out. She had dismantled arrogance with composure and destroyed prejudice with precision. The passengers who had doubted her, who had looked at her and believed Jenna's assumptions, now looked at her differently, no longer as a passenger but as a leader, a woman whose very presence demanded respect. A murmur of apology drifted from the couple in row 1, whispered just loud enough for Naomi to hear. The businessman in row 2 set his phone down entirely, ashamed that he had treated the moment as entertainment. And the woman in row 3, tears shimmering in her eyes, pressed her chain to her lips and whispered, "Thank you," though she was not sure Naomi even heard. The captain returned to the cockpit to coordinate with the ground crew, leaving Derek and Jenna behind in their humiliation. Jenna stood stiff, her face pale, her confidence shattered. She had once believed her phone and her uniform gave her power over anyone who sat before her. Now she understood that arrogance crumbles when confronted with truth. Derek remained seated, his clipboard useless in his lap, his authority stripped. Passengers avoided their eyes, unwilling to offer sympathy. Naomi had made sure that this was not a lesson hidden in paperwork or excuses. It was a lesson branded into memory, undeniable, irreversible. As the aircraft taxied back to its position, the cabin settled into a calmer rhythm. But beneath the calm, a sense of awakening pulsed. Passengers whispered to one another, not gossiping, but reflecting, asking themselves what they would have done if Naomi had not been who she was. Would they have spoken up? Would they have let silence bury the injustice? Would they have been complicit? These questions pressed against their hearts, questions that would follow them long after they disembarked. Naomi's confrontation had become their mirror, showing them both the flaws of society and the power of courage. By the time the jet landed in New York, news of the incident had already spread. The businessman's half-recorded video found its way online despite his regret, and snippets of Jenna's live stream, cut off abruptly when she dropped her phone, circulated like wildfire. Within hours, hashtags began trending. Dignity, in the sky, Naomi Carter, respect first class. Millions of people watched, debated, and reflected. Some were outraged at the arrogance Naomi had endured. Others were inspired by the way she had responded, with calm, not chaos, with facts, not fury. The story resonated because it was not only about a CEO on a jet. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or doubted, and about the possibility of standing tall in those moments. Consolidated, Airways International moved swiftly. The public apology Morrison had promised went live within the hour, not as a hidden statement buried on a corporate website, but as a press conference broadcast globally. He acknowledged the discriminatory nature of the incident, detailed the immediate firings and suspensions, and announced new reforms inspired directly by Naomi's demands. Unconscious bias training would be mandatory for all frontline staff. Verification protocols would be revised to eliminate prejudiced assumptions. A real-time reporting system would be established, allowing passengers to escalate complaints directly to executive oversight. And most importantly, a diversity and dignity dashboard would be created, with quarterly reports shared publicly, ensuring that accountability would not fade with time. The reforms stunned the industry. Competitor airlines scrambled to issue statements, some in solidarity, others out of fear of falling behind. Advocacy groups praised Naomi for using her influence not for personal revenge, but for systemic change. Journalists hailed the incident as a turning point, writing headlines like, "CEO turns flight humiliation into corporate reform," and Naomi Carter's quiet storm, how dignity grounded discrimination. The world was not just watching, it was learning. For Naomi, however, the media storm was secondary. What mattered to her were the quiet ripples she began to hear. Emails poured in from strangers, young women of color who said they had found strength in her composure, employees in industries far removed from aviation who said they finally believed they could speak up, even parents who said they had shared her story with their children as proof that dignity can defeat cruelty. Naomi read them in the quiet of her office, each message reminding her that leadership was not about titles or contracts, but about leaving behind a legacy of courage. Weeks later, Naomi sat in a boardroom facing executives from Consolidated Airways International. They were polished, rehearsed, and anxious, eager to prove they had acted swiftly. But Naomi was not interested in gestures. She laid out her expectations with the same clarity she had shown on the jet. Measurable progress, transparent, reporting, and long-term commitment. "Change is not a press release," she told them, her voice steady. "It is a culture, and culture does not shift with one apology. It shifts with accountability, with humility, with the willingness to confront arrogance every time it appears. That is what I expect from you." Her words carried no theatrics, only truth, and the executives nodded, not because they were forced to, but because they understood they were in the presence of someone who had turned humiliation into reform. Months passed, but the story did not fade. The passengers who had witnessed it carried it into their own lives, recounting to friends, colleagues, and families what they had seen. The woman in row 3 told her daughter, reminding her never to let anyone tell her she did not belong. The businessman in row 2, once guilty of treating the confrontation as entertainment, became one of the loudest advocates in his own company for fairness in customer relations. Even the couple in row 1, who had whispered their doubts, admitted publicly that they had learned to see beyond assumptions. The flight that had begun in arrogance ended in transformation, not just for the airline, but for everyone who had been present. Naomi, for her part, moved forward with the same composure she had always carried. She did not need to relive the incident, did not seek to glorify it. But she knew its meaning. She knew that when arrogance had tried to humiliate her, she had chosen dignity, and in doing so, she had given others permission to believe that dignity could win. She understood that her story was no longer her own. It belonged to every person who had been silenced, every passenger told they did not belong, every employee dismissed for speaking the truth. It belonged to all who believed that respect should not depend on the color of one's skin, the gender one carried, or the title one held, but on humanity itself. On a quiet evening months later, Naomi sat in her office, the city lights glowing, beyond the glass windows. She looked at a framed note sent by a young woman she had never met. The note read simply, "I was afraid to speak. Then I saw what you did on that flight. Now I know silence is not the only choice." Naomi smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the light of the city, her heart steady with the knowledge that the storm she had endured had left behind a legacy of courage. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering the cold slap of that ticket against her chest and then remembering the warmth of her own composure. She had not fired a crew out of vengeance. She had held a mirror up to arrogance, and in doing so, she had changed more than a flight. She had changed the way people believed dignity could stand against prejudice. And so, her legacy took flight. Not in the engines of jets or the contracts of corporations, but in the hearts of people who carried her story forward, proving that leadership, at its core, is not about power, but about humanity.